Well, we want to turn our attention to Palestine, which our last guest left us on there in her last sentence, and the ongoing struggle of the resistance, which has not been crushed despite the huge amount of military power that has been directed towards them. Interesting phenomenon, something that deserves more discussion. So, for that discussion, we are honored to be joined here by Jon Elmer, who's a contributing editor at the Electronic Intifada. Jon, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Well, great to have you here. And I think, this is a question a lot of people are asking. Of course, the Israeli Defense Forces said, we've cleared out North Gaza, we've cleared out Central Gaza, we control the whole thing. And then now we're back fighting in many of the places they allegedly totally had under control. And we see the bombs, we see the money, we see the planes. So there's obviously something asymmetric happening here that's allowing the resistance to remain resilient despite this huge military force. It's a big question, I guess, to start on, but that's where I wanted to start. I mean, how is it even possible that despite the tens of thousands of tons of bombs in some of these areas, they still seem to be a very effective fighting force?
Yeah, absolutely effective fighting force. They don't seem to be degraded in any way. And as you said, the Israelis claimed that they had control over these areas sometimes as far back as November. And they go back into somewhere like Jabalia in the last few weeks and get hit really hard with all different types of operations, with all different types of communications that seem to show their command and control is still perfectly intact. They're still using appropriate weapons. They're able to move through their tunnels completely. U.S. intelligence estimates say that the Qassam brigades, the main fighting force, are 75% intact still. So what you have is just you have a genocide. You have mass destruction of Palestinian life, targeting civilian populations who themselves are resisting and resilient in a way that's impressive. But then you have a fighting force that is not degraded and is still able to meet the Israelis anywhere the Israelis are, which is something that's true for Palestinians all over the West Bank, Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. They're able to meet the Israelis wherever they are with whatever tools they have. In some cases in the West Bank, that's throwing stones. And in the Gaza Strip, it's with anti-tank missiles that were created by the Qassam brigades. It's rockets that were built in Gaza. We saw today a drone dropping a homemade grenade on Israeli forces. We see sniper operations daily, and none of these things match the Israeli casualty numbers that we're seeing, incidentally. Interestingly, to go along with all the other Israeli lies, they lie about their casualties in an effort to keep morale within their state up. And because they know that if they were to see the Israeli population were to see how destructive this war has been on Israeli soldiers, the popularity would be even less than it is, which, according to Yedioth Ahronot, their leading newspaper, only 10% of Israelis think they're winning the war now, 8 months on. 40% think Hamas is winning. So those kind of numbers coming from a place with a military censor, with a news media that looks a lot like the United States, just, not reporting on the war in Iraq or Afghanistan, except from American soldiers' point of view. The Israelis have the same thing. So they're not getting a complete picture of the fight, and they still know they're losing. So, and I think just the resilience of the population is something that I always want to point out, especially if we're going to talk about the resistance, because the resistance is from the population. They're part of the population. They say they fight in the same trench as their population, and the population is more in support of them today than they were on October 6th. So it's obvious within the Palestinian political milieu that resistance is what leads to popularity in their communities.
Jon, I had you on Dispatches a few weeks back, and it was an excellent episode. I encourage people to check it out at some point. Not now, because not during the live stream, but when the live stream's over. It was a really good conversation, sort of breaking down the military resistance and what it's accomplished and what it's doing. And, I remember just after October 7th, and then as the months went on, there was a lot of conversation, and I was in Lebanon most of that time. There was a lot of conversation about, well, how long can Hamas last? How long can the Qassam brigades last? And no one really knew. It was just kind of guesses. And so people were throwing out numbers like 6 months. They're prepared for 6 months. And you'd hear they're prepared for 9 months. Then you had some people who on the Zionist side had some wishful thinking saying, oh, they've only got a few weeks. worth until they're out of like weapons and food or something. So we're approaching 8 months. And now, I've been asking this question again. And what I'm hearing, at least here in Lebanon, is, no one really knows, but they seem to be doing okay. Obviously, Gaza's not doing okay, but the military resistance is not sending out alerts of like, you guys were about to be extinguished. And I think their ability to fire back in these spaces where the Israelis are saying, oh, we've destroyed all of Hamas there, is a testament to that. And now people are throwing out numbers. And again, no one really knows, but based on the confidence that Hamas military seems to have, 2 years, 3 years maybe, that they could, keep doing this. I don't know if that's true. However, the Israelis are saying that they see this going into the end of the year. And then you've got some people saying they could see this happening into a, new Trump administration if Trump were to win the presidential election. And I guess I'm curious, people are wondering, and this is also just like asking you to guess too, but it does, at least at the very least, like, what are your thoughts on how long the Palestinian resistance has been able to maintain its ability to fight up until now, and seems to be able to keep going for at least a while longer?
Yeah, and Israel can't stop the war right now because if they do, they'll lose, and they can't see it like that. And so they've extended their plans. I mean, the Americans gave them till early January to fight, and obviously these red lines have been plowed through for months now. The Abu Obaida, the spokesperson for the Qassam Brigade, said that they're ready to negotiate an end to the war, but also they're ready for a war of attrition, and they're still fighting as a national army. But were that to be degraded, they could fight as a guerrilla force indefinitely. So there's no time when the Palestinian resistance is going to stop fighting. That's not a scenario that's going to happen. We're looking constantly for signposts of any kind of degrading of their capacity, seeing them using weapons that they wouldn't otherwise use if they had full stocks, and we don't see anything like that yet. The Palestinians were patient. They prepared this operation, this attack on October 7th that dismantled the IDF. They planned it for years, and they knew they had a fight on their hands. It's a national liberation struggle, and there's no amount of destruction that will stop this war. Israel has to negotiate an exchange of prisoners and handle some kind of diplomatic solution that deals with the situation in Lebanon, that deals with Ansar Allah in the Red Sea. There's many components to this fight that don't show any signs of slowing up. And dragging out the war is really Israel's way of preventing a defeat, because if they were to withdraw and negotiate for their prisoners, it would be seen as a loss within their society. So they're actually literally letting their people die, if not killing them, rather than negotiating a solution to this conflict that would allow thousands of Palestinian prisoners to be freed, and for Israelis to be able to move back into the areas in the south, in the Gaza envelope, that are completely abandoned, just like they are in the north, completely abandoned. Israel's buffer zones are, for the first time in its history, inside of its country. It's lost its strategic depth. There's lots of reasons from an Israeli perspective why you would want to have a diplomatic solution to this fight, but they just don't seem capable of that at all. Within their current government structure, within their current military structure, the loss of face of their institutions on October 7th, to just abandon their people to that catastrophic defeat that they suffered at the hands of the Qassam brigades. Their attempt to restore faith in the institution is to carry out this brutal genocide that we're watching, where they believe that they can respond to military defeats like their soldier being captured in Jabalia last weekend, by the very next day massacring families inside tents. It's just brutal. And it's a long history of Israel responding to military defeats by massacring the civilian population. But there's all kinds of things happening in Israeli society that show that they can't carry out this war. They're not able to carry out a war of attrition in the same way the Palestinians are. The resilience of the resistance, the resilience of the Palestinian people who are all with the resistance, that equation is a lot stronger than a settler colonial state who have significant percentages of their population holding second passports and can leave the country and will leave the country. The thought that Israel can repopulate the north, the way that Hezbollah has been attacking with just a fraction of their capability, and it's the same as the Gaza envelope. Who's going to go live in the Gaza envelope after Israel showed everybody that they'll just abandon you in the tunnels rather than negotiate to release you for elderly Palestinian prisoners or Palestinian children who in any other country wouldn't be in a jail and are held in military prisons inside Israel? They've completely lost their way, even from their own point of view. And so the Palestinian resilience is far greater than the Israeli resilience. A war of attrition is not going to be something that helps the Israelis out of this situation.
You mentioned this a little bit at the top, and I was hoping you could talk more about it. I mean, the indigenous weapons production that is happening there in Palestine, which I think we've seen, quite a bit of, obviously, in the videos that have come out. But, the advanced nature of it, the tandem charges and the Yasin RPG, all these different pieces. Like, this is not just someone cobbling something together in their garage here. I mean, it seems that this is a major part of how the resistance had prepared for this kind of confrontation, is that they've developed an indigenous capability to produce advanced weaponry.
Yeah, and they can use the weapons that don't explode that are dropped by the Israelis constantly to restock those supplies. But yeah, the thing
Yeah.
that the genius move that the Palestinian resistance did was, instead of having sophisticated weapons that had to be smuggled in, they built their own weapons. Copies of historically successful weapons. They didn't try to reinvent the wheel. They perfected it. And they've done that with the tandem charge anti-tank weapon, the Yasin, which allows their fighters to move through tunnels because they're light, and move out into the streets, move through the alleys, and target tanks from a distance, a very intimate distance. And that weapon, mass produced, is worth far more than more sophisticated weapons that are more cumbersome to move around. And so the fighters have set up a supply of weapons that are perfect for the fight in the Gaza Strip. And Israel's seeing that right now. They don't seem to have any shortage of these weapons, despite the fact, as you said, that some people thought the war would be 3 months, some people thought 6 months, and now Qassam's telling us they're ready for a war of attrition. They're not willing to give in at this point, and give in to the ceasefire negotiations. They're making the ceasefire negotiations be determined on the battlefield using weapons that they've developed over the last 25 or 30 years, with a philosophy of getting these weapons in the hands of each of their fighters rather than having a few specialized units. They have them in the hands of all of their fighters, and their fighters can operate on a cell-based network, and strike from very intimate distance and make these weapons even more successful than they are in their training manuals, because they're able to move so close. They know the area, they know the refugee camps. They're using the destruction that Israel has wrought as fighting positions, and that has helped the resistance. So Israel's doesn't even have a good internal strategy, let alone their overarching, dismantling of Zionism that we're watching in front of the entire world. The legitimacy of their project is forever destroyed. And these war crimes charges and just what the world has witnessed will stick with them forever.
Jon, I want to zoom out for a moment and talk regionally, because as we saw yesterday, Nikki Haley, former ambassador to the UN, visited the Gaza envelope area, visited, I think, West Bank settlements, and then went to the north and signed some Israeli bombs with the statement "finish them," which was so genocidal and disgusting. Because those bombs, we know, are basically aimed at children intentionally. But all that's to say, she was in the north signing that bomb. And at the end of the day, after Israel's finished in Gaza, whatever it means to be finished, they're going to have to deal with the situation in the north. And of course, Hezbollah says that they've attached their war with Israel in South Lebanon with Israel's genocide in Gaza. The genocide ends, Hezbollah will stop firing. It's not clear that that's the sort of narrative Israel's going to be okay with. They're going to want some sort of victory narrative out of that, and there is a fear that they'll want to escalate into a bigger war because, there is this thinking in some circles in Israel that, first of all, it's like the longer we wait to take on Hezbollah, the stronger they're going to be, but they're already too strong. And they're kind of being held back at the moment by the Americans on that front. Because the Americans don't think the Israelis can win. But I guess I want to ask for your analysis on what the Israelis, nobody knows what they're going to do. They're quite illogical and unpredictable, but maybe they're not suicidal. I don't know. But if Israel were to engage in some sort of broader war on Lebanon, what might that look like for Israel?
Oh, I mean, Hezbollah has the ability to attack with precision missiles all over Israel in a way that the Palestinians simply do not. The Palestinians are besieged in an enclave that they have been besieged in for an entire generation. Hezbollah is the exact opposite. Hezbollah has thousands of cadre that have fought for the last decade. They fought in Syria, they train in Iran. They have all the connections to the outside world that are necessary for bringing in these kind of weapons. Israel provoking an open war with Hezbollah would change the state of Israel forever. People will just simply not want to live in that state once they realize what capacity Hezbollah has. So, but people are saying they're not going to move back into the north unless there's a fight in the north. Even people were saying on that 60 Minutes with Leslie Stahl, she went up to Metula and the settlement head said that 40% of people won't move back to those communities if there's a negotiated settlement. They demand a war. And that war is just going to be so destructive for Israel that I think, it'll hasten the decline of their state. And that's the reason, at least in part, why the Americans don't want the Israelis to do that. Because I think the American assessments of Hezbollah are a little bit more sober than the Israelis, who are, dealing with generation-long now defeats in 2000, defeats in 2006, rules of engagement that are determined by Hezbollah in the north. And so there's a lot of, military prestige that has been robbed of the Israelis by Hezbollah. And it's in that window that the Palestinians in Gaza have fought. The Palestinians watched the 2006 defeat. They prepared in the same way, the same use of tunnels, the same to protect their fighters, to store their weapons. And so these lessons between Palestinians and Hezbollah have been exchanged back and forth for multiple generations now. It's hard to see the way that Israel benefits by attacking Hezbollah. The entire state of Israel would just be living in bomb shelters because Hezbollah has missile capacity that Israel has never faced before, and they have it in enormous numbers. We don't know the exact numbers, but even Israeli and American estimates suggest that the country of Israel would never be the same if there was a war with Hezbollah. Just frankly, it's just the truth.
Somewhat speculation, but it feels. Oh, can you hear me now?
Muted, but you're fine now. Yes.
Perfect. Sorry about that, but this is also speculation, I was saying, but it seems like there's almost a downstream effect here on how we also view the U.S. military. Because, obviously there's a lot of the same weaponry, F-35s, F-16s, but similar kind of military strategy as well. And it feels that the exposure of the Israeli military here in this context is also maybe saying something about sort of the broader Western military machines that hold themselves out as all-powerful, omnipotent and can crush anyone, that perhaps that isn't as true as it sounds when the weapons contractors are talking about it.
Yeah, and you could see that on October 7th. Israel had this $1 billion iron wall that they bragged about for years that they were building. They built it down into the ground to try to stop the tunnels that were going underneath. They have this entire signals network above with computers connecting automatic machine guns, the whole deal. It was dismantled by off-the-shelf drones dropping Qassam-made munitions on top of them. and completely turned them dark. The Israelis didn't have any command and control for the entire day of October 7th. In fact, they didn't have it for some days after. They were still fighting in the envelope on the Friday after the Saturday attack, so almost an entire week later. And Israel's been shown to not be the ally that they were thought to be, the imperial outpost in the Middle East, because they're a liability. They're a liability to the American project at this point. They're dismantling the entire post-World War II architecture that has served the Americans so well. And then on their fighting prowess, you have just like straight up American soldiers making fun of the Israelis for their pathetic training and capacity on the battlefield. And all of these things are emboldening Israel's enemies. It doesn't make, there's no deterrence happening here. It's quite the opposite. If you can't defeat Hamas in a besieged territory where they're building their own weapons, you're not going to stand a chance against a much larger force, a much better armed force, a much better prepared force in Hezbollah. And so I think the Americans are trying to hold Israel back, because they see them as the 51st state in that sense, and they don't want them to destroy themselves. And that's why on October 7th, the Americans immediately dispatched aircraft carriers, advanced surveillance, put drones up in the air, gave Israel assets, air defense assets, intelligence assets, because they needed to focus on Hezbollah and to try to keep that front in check. And the Israelis have needed the Americans at every stage of this. When Iran attacked, it ended up, just by straight numbers, ended up being 3/4 American and their allies protecting Israel. Israel needs airlifts, literally daily airlifts of weapons from the United States to fight this war. They need tens of billions of dollars from Congress repeatedly over and over again to fight this population that's undergoing a genocide that has been blockaded for 20 years. People growing up in Gaza have never left Gaza. They've never seen a Jewish person because the Israelis just policed from the outside like a prison guard. And still, as soon as they moved in, it was just defeat after defeat for the Israelis on tactical levels, on strategic levels. It's been a catastrophic failure for Israel, and that's why they keep going. It's the sunk cost fallacy. They believe that if they just fight a little more, they'll get one more brigade, and if they get that one more brigade, maybe they'll find their captives. And all of that is just ridiculous. It's not true. It hasn't even been close to happening. Israel hasn't achieved, even modestly achieved, any of its goals in this war. So Israel looks like a liability. Their country's in disarray. They call themselves beleaguered, all from the resistance in Gaza, which has inspired resistance from Hezbollah and, of course, resistance from Ansar Allah in Yemen, which is just heroic resistance when you consider what the Yemenis have been through for the last decade at the hands of Saudi American military blockades themselves. It's the people who were blockaded themselves that are coming to the defense of a country that's being blockaded. And so there's a lot of elements to this conflict that go on beyond Gaza that are just simply out of Israel's hands at this point, without some kind of a proper diplomatic solution. That Israel just doesn't seem to have any capacity for that kind of sober strategic thinking. And they just keep, digging themselves a deeper and deeper hole, so that their state is in question. And their state is in question. The legitimacy of Israel, as it should have been decades ago, is clearly in question in large parts of the world. It's hard here. I'm in Canada. It's hard in North America sometimes when you're inundated with the media and you think Israel's in a strong position. The entire world sees what Israel is doing. They see them as the killers of children. They don't see them at any military success at all. And it started with October 7th when they were completely dismantled. Their Gaza division was dismantled literally in minutes. Within a half an hour, their Gaza command completely crumbled. Their command and control didn't function at all. Soldiers were fighting and taking body armor off other dead soldiers to fight. This isn't the state that Americans believed were getting these tens of billions of dollars every few years to outfit themselves technologically, their constant training. It was all just shown to be a ruse. And what's been shown to be successful are copies of Soviet and Chinese weapons from 50 years ago that have been improved upon by the Qassam brigades and to devastating effect, plus the tunnel network that Palestinians literally dug with their own hands over the course of 20 years to protect their fighters, to allow their fighters to move around, and to make occupation of Gaza impossible in any way. They can't hold any territory at all. And so they massacre the civilians in the hope that that will somehow put pressure. If you starve them to death, if you bomb them in tent camps with American munitions that they call a small diameter bomb that was dropped in the middle of a group of tents that number tens of thousands. It's just a horrific scene in Rafah. And this is made in America. It's a made in America defeat of the Israelis, and it's a made in Gaza victory for the Palestinians. And I think that that's something that history will point to for a long time. War colleges will study this for generations to come, and liberation struggles will see what is possible. And like your previous guest said, we don't get to despair when the Palestinians, under these brutal circumstances, can show us victory.
Well, Jon, we really appreciate you here, and you're covering all of this very closely and very consistently at the Electronic Intifada, so I hope everyone is checking you out there. Jon Elmer, contributing editor at the Electronic Intifada. Thanks so much for some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for having me.